Hello, and thank you for joining us for this live webinar. Over the years, journalism has faced numerous changes and challenges, and today is no exception. The Deseret News, now 175 years old, has been a steadfast presence through it all. Today, we're answering your questions about the state of journalism. If you're joining us via Zoom, feel free to submit a question in the Q&A, and we may answer it during the stream. I'm Lee Benson. I've been a columnist here at the Deseret News for a number of years, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Lois Collins, who is our star reporter.
Oh, thanks.
And we're going to learn a lot from Lois today. Combining our experience, we've worked at the Deseret News for about 95 years.
But we're not old. You always
No,
know that.
No. We're going to start by discussing our experience and the changes we've seen, and then we'll transition into reader-submitted questions. Let's jump right in. Lois, how has reporting changed since you began in the industry?
So I think that the tone of journalism has changed a little bit. Media organizations are sort of picking the things that they cover more as opposed to just covering everything in the community. That has been a big change. But I think the biggest changes have actually been technological. You and I both got here before the internet was invented, which is kind of crazy to think about. But I used to call people and ask them to email me, or not even email, send me by postal service some sort of report that was considered really, really important. And then I'd wait for 6 days for it to arrive. And that's a big difference because you can get something instantly. You can get information instantly. And the news cycle is instant. What do you think?
Well, and then, yeah, I totally agree. I remember back in the day when somebody returning my phone call, my entire story depended on that.
Yeah, right.
And that's before cell phones. So you just stay right close to your landline, because if the phone rang and your source was calling you on the phone, you were in business. And if it didn't, you didn't have really very many other places
and
to go.
Absolutely no way to control it. That actually is a really big change because it's so much easier to have a backup person. If somebody doesn't call you, it's so much easier now to find sources online where you can say, okay, if X doesn't call me, hopefully Y or Z will, because I send out messages to all of them saying, help me with this.
In so many ways, it's gotten so much easier, but in some ways it's gotten harder. Like, I mean, we go back far enough where I could go to the telephone book and find somebody's address or phone number. And so as much as things have gotten more public, they in some ways gotten more private.
That's actually an interesting point because you used to not have to deal with all of these organizations that sort of think that they own people's phone numbers, or
Right.
You have to sometimes pay to get background information on somebody or get a subscription to a service in order to look somebody up. We used to not only have phone books, but you could go down to the library and there was the pulp directories, which was also, it was a little labor intensive to do it, but it was also free, which is kind of an interesting thing. So what about memorable stories? What are some of the most interesting things you feel like you've covered?
Oh, boy, I've done so many. That's a hard one to pin down. But because I've had the privilege of writing columns for a lot of years, and the ones that I've enjoyed later on, I did sports columns forever, and then I've done slice of life columns. And I think about the ones that are just so, everybody's got a story, but sometimes you just hear these stories that are just amazing. I remember one when I went to Moab and I interviewed a woman who'd fallen off a cliff when she was out running. She was a triathlete, and her dog kept her warm for 2 nights. She broke her pelvis, and then the third day, the dog, whose name was Jazz, and I'll never forget this story, went all the way into town, like 5 miles, and barked at people until he brought him back to to the woman, and it saved her life. And I'm there in her home interviewing her, and there's the dog, right next to her.
Well,
Stories like that.
Yeah, you and I have actually had kind of a different trajectory than a lot of people because we've both done human interest.
That's
Most
right.
of our careers, that's what we've done. you start out and you cover things like the legislature or city council meetings and that kind of thing. But if I have been really lucky in that I was able to not be so meeting oriented and cover stories about people who are doing great or awful things, but on a personal level where you can get to know them and really tell the story of people who don't get a lot of stories told about them. They're not public officials. Same thing with you. We've covered a lot of the poor, the struggling, the quietly triumphant. We've done all of those stories.
Yep. People are what make this business fun, I think. How do you find stories?
Sometimes I get pitched. I think it helps to be like an old dog like us because people know us, they know our work. And so people will say, hey, this is a story that made me think of you and I wonder if you want to tell it. I also have a real tendency to ask people what stories they're not seeing and to engage with people in a way that helps. But whenever I do, like I have the health beat, and when I'm talking to somebody on the health beat, I might say, what are some other interesting stories? I mean, I have no pride. I'll beg you for your idea.
Well, it's the easiest and hardest part of the job is to find stories. In fact, anybody who's watching, email us, give us story tips. People always start off an email to me like, you probably get bombarded with this, but I just thought I'd give you this idea. And I'm thinking, now, bring it on.
How many emails do you get, though, a day?
Well,
I probably missed some good ones.
that's true. There's a lot that come in, but I'm pretty focused in on if anybody says, I've got a story idea for you.
That's probably what I should have people do is put story idea in the subject line because I get a fair amount of spam, too. So I try to keep up on it, but it's hard sometimes. Where do you get most of your ideas?
Well, it goes across the board. I mean, when you're in this business, you're always looking for an angle or for a story. So it's watching the news, or it's listening to the radio, or it's just being aware of pop culture.
You don't have a particular beat. I'm at least lucky to have kind of a feeder beat,
Right.
which helps. So with aging or family news, there's sort of a lane that you can mine and people that you can mine. But there are lots of times when I have a story, somebody passes to me that I might say, oh, that's more of a Lee story, or that's more of a Jason story. So I think we also feed each other a little bit, which helps a lot.
Well, I tend to keep them all.
Selfish.
So what about deadlines? Over the years, have they just gotten easier for you?
No, we're always on deadline, and I struggle sometimes with deadlines, and I struggle too. So it's hard to have like an 8-hour job when you do this because, like you said, you're dependent on people calling you back. You're dependent on reaching the right people. You're dependent on what else comes in, and the news cycle really is 24/7. So certain stories can be pushed off until tomorrow morning because they don't have a time element. But there are a lot of stories that if you're late to it, you're late to it. So no, deadlines have not gotten easier. And it's a point of pride that I usually don't break a deadline. I make it, but it's not always easy.
And I've always said a deadline is really the greatest gift we have a lot of times, because if we're left to our own devices, we'd just still be writing War and Peace somewhere and it would never get finished.
Yeah, no, I find when I get really stuck, this is the stupidest thing, but my trick when I get really, really, really stuck is I go clean my oven. I think there's literally something therapeutic about doing something you want to do, even less than you want to try to figure out how to make the story work when it's not working for you.
So what about this, where maybe there might be sensitive things, or maybe the editor or the owner of the paper might have a particular bias about something. How have you dealt with that through the years?
Really straightforwardly. I talk through things like that. There are cases. So one of the most contentious things that you have to deal with sometimes is when is it appropriate not to use somebody's name, not to identify them in any particular way. And I think there's been so much scamming done with that. There've been like Pulitzer Prize winners who, it turned out, made up a source or something, that I am very protective of that kind of thing. So if there's a really good reason not to use somebody's name, I always make sure that I talk it through with my editor and that my editor knows who that person is. knows, absolutely knows that they're real. And it has to be a really good reason not to use a name. Sometimes we do that with someone who is the victim of a terrible sexual assault. There are reasons that we can do that, but most of the time we don't. And I ask people to tell me really, really, really private things sometimes, especially covering medicine. I ask all sorts of invasive questions. And so I tell people right up front, I'm going to ask you all sorts of invasive questions. And if there's something that you're particularly sensitive about, then let's talk about it. Because my goal telling sensitive stories is not to make somebody's life worse or more miserable. So I'm just really kind of, let's talk it through, whether it's with an editor or with a colleague, a co-writer, or with the subject. How about you?
Well, and again, as a columnist, I have had a little bit different experience, but I will say in like 50 something years here at Deseret News, um, I've rarely ever been censored.
Yeah, same here.
I feel like journalism is a business where you can't always please, you can't ever please everyone all the time. But when you know who your editor is and who your owner is, I think there's this almost sixth sense that's helpful so that you know what lines you can cross and what lines you can't cross.
Yeah, and I'm more worried, I think, about crossing lines with the people I write about. And there are things that are sensitive that you don't see coming. I did a story probably 25 years ago about a guy who was a handsome young man who was in an explosion and his face was terribly, terribly burned. And he had to wear a Jobst mask, pressure mask. And it was terrible. People acted absolutely appalling with him in public. He once went into a fast food restaurant and somebody saw him in a mask and decided that he was going to rob the place and jumped him. But the thing that it turned out he was sensitive about, and this was a real lesson to me, was that as his scars were healing, he had to wear pantyhose. He had to wear, they call them jopes, but it was to him the equivalent of pantyhose. And he was really sensitive about anybody knowing that. That somehow was like the final straw for the loss of so many things for him. And I learned to ask people or to talk through in advance if it was a personal story. I mean, politicians, I don't do this with, but if you're telling me your personal story, I'm going to talk through it with you a little bit about, are you sensitive about this? Because people will let you write it anyway if they know it's coming. But if you surprise them with it, then sometimes it's painful.
Yeah, the one truism that I've found in this business, and I'm interested to hear your comment, but people like to talk.
Yeah.
And it's the lifeblood, really, of journalism. If people didn't talk, in fact, if I'm watching TV and I watch somebody and they're in some kind of a fix or they've committed a crime or something, and oftentimes I'll shout out. My wife could verify this. Don't talk. Talking is the one thing that gets people either in trouble or out of trouble.
That's actually legal advice too. If you're accused of a crime, they say just shut up.
Right.
Don't say anything.
But I've always been amazed and impressed at how much people like to talk. And once you get into a conversation with them where they feel like you're not the enemy, that they can trust you, then they really open up.
And don't you feel like we're a little bit protective of that privilege? That we're not, there has to be a really good reason to not respect the things that could maybe cause people harm. Like people will tell me things sometimes and I think it's not really necessary for the story. And they maybe don't see what it will lead to in their life.
Happens all the time.
So yeah. It's really common. And so I also see myself not only as a repackager and a re-storyteller, but I'm telling your story. I'm going to not make it cause you more harm because you were not used to having your story told and you didn't know how to be protective. So I'm a little bit protective of that. So we have a question from Heather who wants to know, what is a journalist's first priority? Do you feel it's typically unbiased facts or getting across an agenda? And how can we tell when factual reporting is tainted by opinion? You want to start and I'll jump in?
Let me absorb it. Let's see. first priority, I think the first priority of a journalist is to tell the truth. Now that's easier said than done, I think. Finding out exactly what the truth is.
Yep.
And but I think if you fall off that principle or standard, then you could get in some trouble.
It's tricky because the whole question about unbiased facts, especially nowadays, it seems like we have different biases toward what is fact. So you could take something as contentious as vaccines. What is fact? People have different opinions on what fact is, so that's tricky. Part of my career that has been really rewarding is the part where I'm telling people stories and their facts are their facts. It's a little bit different when you get in two sides of a debate on some contentious issue like vaccines or, no, there are a million contentious issues right now. When you talk about telling the truth, though, I really am not happy with the idea of spreading what we know are not true. The things that are clearly made up, I don't think...
Just because you have a source that says that.
No, I don't think you plow down the middle when you know somebody is either misinformed or lying, but you need to back up your decision on that with actual facts and with actual sources.
And that's the tricky part about journalism and why it's somehow gotten a little bit of a mess now, because now with the internet and social media, everybody can be a kind of a quasi-journalist.
That's true.
And it is part of the profession to be able to decipher as best you can what is true and what is just furthering somebody's agenda.
Well, and I'll go one step further on that. There's also an audience part of that too, because people are choosing the news sources that will tell them what they want to hear. Where they like...
That's really changed.
Where they like whatever. And that is a huge change in journalism. There's also a question here about why are news outlets so hesitant to release images of people who've committed crimes such as DUI or road rage, victims as well. And that is something that's changed as well. You used to be able to go down and get these pictures. It's not that journalists have made that decision. A lot of those pictures are no longer available. Police departments don't make those pictures available, and we're not down at the station taking mugshots, so it's not even like it's an option. That happens more often than not. With really super high profile people who are accused of crimes, you may have access to photos, but otherwise it generally is not the case anymore. So that's not actually a news outlet issue, but a law enforcement issue most of the time.
So here's a good one for you, Lois. What inspired you to pursue journalism as a career?
So actually, it's kind of a convoluted story. I wanted to write. I'm a pretty good speller. I've always wanted to write. And I tried poetry and it was really bad. And I tried fiction and I'd have to kill my characters because there was nothing I could do with them. I'd get them in this bind and have to destroy them. And what I learned was that I'm a reteller. So you tell me your story, I can retell your story. You give me an idea, I can go research it. But if I have to start from scratch, it's literally scratch. It's garbage. And so that was part of it. And then the second part of it was that my parents were completely blind my entire life. My dad got glaucoma when he was 13 and went blind, and my mom was born blind. And I saw how people seemed to think that they couldn't accomplish great things, or that they weren't smart, or that there was something about their disability that made them less than. And I thought that one way to counter that was to tell the stories of people who don't get their stories told. So there you were, combination of not being original and having sort of an original background.
That's a really interesting story. It was in my next column, maybe.
Yeah, probably not. So Lee, how do you verify information as you're researching things?
Oh, you go to as many other sources as you can, as many people as you possibly can. I remember, one of the big stories in the state and the world really, but especially here at the Deseret News, was when Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped. And that was one of those stories where it was really hard sometimes to verify
Oh, and there's so much information in that particular
what was
story.
going on. And it was personal to us because her uncle Tom Smart was our chief photographer.
Yeah, I'm one of my favorite people.
And that was a lesson to me in, and we don't have enough time to really go into all the depths of it, but it's where the police accused the wrong guy, Richard Reese, who ended up dying in prison. And they had so much evidence, so-called, to back it up. But at the end of the day, he was innocent.
Yeah, nothing.
That really affected me because I knew Tom was a close friend, and I did a lot of columns on that. And it was just an example of sometimes something that looks so true and so real isn't. So that question is a good one, and the answer is it's sometimes hard. It's hard to verify.
So I had a recent experience of not being able to verify something. I did a story about sisters in Utah who were crossing on a highway in a reservation in Arizona, and they were in a car crash. And the person involved said that he'd been drinking, and everybody was reporting that this individual was drunk. And there was no evidence. There was no paperwork to say how much he'd been drinking, what he'd been drinking. The question of whether or not the crash was the girl's fault was clear. It was not the girl's fault. But the question of the role that alcohol did or did not play was unclear. And I spent so many hours talking to tribal police and Arizona police and other police trying to untangle it. And I never did untangle it. So I explained what I'd done to try to untangle it, and that we didn't know. That's all I could do. It's all I could do. And I think that's part of the story with these things is when you are looking for truth or you're researching something and you can't find it out, then say how you researched it and why you couldn't find it out and let people make up their own minds. But I never did put a label on this person.
I think people need to what do they say? Journalism is the first rough draft of history, and it's never always perfect. Never.
So E. Jones sent in a message that said, from the days of William Hearst to Bezos and Murdoch, certain individuals have always exercised control over major news organizations. How do journalists who owe their employment to owners who may have their own agenda maintain independent integrity in their work? Want to take a shot at that?
That's a good question, especially for this newspaper, which is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which most people know. And I think there's always that question or perception of, well, is the church controlling what you write? And as I said earlier, I haven't felt that pressure ever in 50-something years of writing columns or being here at the newspaper. But it's a great question because the reality of it is, well, except for a couple now that are nonprofits who are also owned by somebody.
Yeah, somebody owns
the money. Yeah, that newspapers are all owned by someone and who all have a private agenda as well as a public agenda.
So you can navigate that with story choice by avoiding stories that might put you in conflict. And I think some journalists do that. I think if you're fair, it's usually not an issue. As long as you kind of thread your needle and get voices from both sides and you include the side that you think that your owner falls on. You can also include the other side that is not the side that your owner falls on. I don't believe I know any journalists who just say, this is what my owner wants me to write and I'm going to do it. I don't think that happens. I think that's an exaggeration. And people think where we work for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that somebody's always telling us what to write. And my experience has been like yours. I've been here 43 years and I've not been told what to write.
No.
And I've not been called on.
And I don't think a lot of people believe that, but
no,
that's been my experience.
It's also interesting because people tend to think, sometimes people will talk to us because they think we belong to the church. And sometimes they won't talk to us because they think we belong to the church. And we're a mixed bag. We don't all belong to the church.
No.
So it's, it's interesting from that viewpoint.
So here's a question for you. Lois, from a viewer, what does a typical day or week look like for you as a journalist?
So the thing I like best about my week is that I can have a plan, and if something interesting happens, it can go by the wayside. But normally I have 2 or 3 stories that I'm working on. I usually have a project piece in the work that I'm kind of working on that I'll be picking up and dropping as other things happen. I usually start my day by looking through the news and seeing whether there's something rapid happening on my beat that I want to cover. Like, is there a new study out on the health beat, or is there new research on Alzheimer's disease that I want to do a quick? I kind of think of them as like sorbet. They're a palate cleanser between meals. You do something small, and it kind of gets the wheels going, and then you move on. But I never really know how my week will turn out. And my editor will tell you that Monday we have our pitch meetings, and I tell him what I'm working on. And Friday, I'm still working on 3/4 of those stories. They never happened because other things came in and pushed them out of the way. How about you?
Well, it's really not a fair question to a real journalist who like you,
Or me?
because I'm mostly retired now, and I spend 1 week writing a column where I used to write 4 columns a week. So life's pretty sweet, and it's always has been. And I will say to anyone who's interested, we have a question about those interested in going into journalism. It's a good life.
Great gig.
And I know I'm just talking from personal experience, but I have never felt like it's drudgery to go to work. If you like to write, and you can write fairly quickly, and you're not a total perfectionist, it's a really nice lifestyle. It doesn't pay as much as a doctor, a lawyer, or a plumber, but it's not too bad. But it's really been for me a great lifestyle.
It's a very interesting work. You meet a lot of interesting people. And one of the things that I actually started out kind of shy. And I think a lot of journalists do, and you can kind of hide behind your notebook, or you can hide behind your camera or whatever. But what I have found now is that I have no boundaries. If I have a question, I will ask anybody that question that I want to ask, because somehow I have been freed to do that. And I've done a lot of goofy things that I would never have done. Back in the 90s, I jumped from an airplane for a story when it first became popular. Their tandem. Yeah, I did that mostly to be contrarian. I mean, they didn't think I'd do it. It's like, look around the newsroom. Who's the biggest chicken? She's not a risk taker. Let's see if Lois will do it. And I'm enough of a contrarian that I did it specifically because it was pretty clear they thought I'd say no. And I have been able to cover the Nobel Prize in Sweden. I've been able to cover the building of a clinic in Haiti. You have covered how many Olympics now?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, and when I was talking earlier about this being a great lifestyle, it sent me to like 16 straight Super Bowls at one stretch.
And how many Olympics?
And 10 or 11 Olympics, which actually is the hardest work I've ever done. So,
Oh yeah, it's not.
but the other stuff, the Super Bowls, and this was back in the good old sports days, but went to a lot of World Series and Super Bowls and Final Fours. But then in this other incarnation, whatever I'm doing now.
Yeah, can't be in
I remember being in Denver for the Democratic National Convention, when Obama gave his speech there in Mile High Stadium. And I thought, if there was a place to place a bet on the presidential race, I'd put a whole bunch on Obama right now. And of course it was true, but
yeah,
there's been a lot of really fun experiences and interesting
lots of things you never expect to do. So you have to be curious, you have to be open, you have to be willing to learn new things. But it's also one of the beauties of it is that it's like the goal to continuous education, which is really, it's the road to continuous education, which is really interesting. And I like that about it. What are you working on right now?
Oh, what? Well, it's as you said, it's constant. It's always a work in progress. Like this afternoon, I'm going to Springville to interview the owner of the Clyde Companies, a construction company conglomerate, because they're moving buildings that they got from the Wendover airfield right after World War II, and now they're going to send them back to Wendover. So it should be an interesting story, but that's what I'm working on right now.
By the way, that was an unfair question, but I didn't want you to ask me that question. It came in from a reader, and I was not willing to answer it because right now I'm sort of fluffing around between projects I haven't finished. And I didn't want you to ask me what I was working on because I haven't decided.
Well, okay, how about this one? And this is from a reader. What is the story that took you the longest to research and write? And you've written some big ones.
Probably Huntington's disease. I did a story about 4 generations of a family that had Huntington's disease, and I had not even heard of the disease. This was like the year 2000. I didn't know enough about it to know anything. And it was an interesting time in medical history, too, because we still had pre-existing conditions. We're starting to get genetic testing that was more common, and all of these things mattered to this family because do you want to get a genetic test if you find out something that is going to become a pre-existing condition when you're older and you have it? And this particular family had multiple kids, and it was a really vulnerable story, and they were very honest and open with me. And there was a lot of disagreement, actually, between one member of the family and an in-law. And they were also open to letting me tell that story and how the disease had kind of driven a wedge between them. So that was probably the one that I worked on the longest. And even then, it was probably 3 or 4 months, and it was not it was not the only thing I was doing. I was still reporting daily stuff, but kind of pulling that together.
Yeah, it's a sad story. I remember
You did a follow-up.
Yeah, I did with one of the kids who genetically got tested and found out that he had Huntington's.
And that's a really hard one to have in your future. But the thing that was so important about that story was that they were so open to helping educate other people and so honest about what happens when a really hard to take disease enters your life. And
Right.
so I will always love that family. And I've kept in touch with them over the years. I will always love that family for helping me to learn so much about human nature and about illness and about grace. There's just a whole bunch in that story.
Yeah, they faced a tough one. So what's the most important lesson you've learned in your journalism career? That's from another viewer.
Think it through. I did when I was a very, very, very young journalist. We had an intern who thought it would be, this is kind of an embarrassing story, who thought it would be a great idea to do a story about houses where someone had been killed. What was it like to live in a house that had a kind of a haunting past? And I thought that was a great idea. And I didn't think through the fact that sometimes people don't know that they live in houses that have haunted past. And we sent out letters to addresses where these terrible news events had occurred. And I should have roped in an editor. So that's probably the most important lesson. When something's tricky, ask your editor instead of letting them get tons of mail and phone calls after they received this horrible letter saying, "Hey, what's up? How you doing in your house where blah, blah happened?" You know, it was a rookie mistake. It was like a poor rookie mistake.
There are times where you just would like to pull it back. I wrote a column about the petroglyphs in 9 Mile Canyon once and compared them to kindergarten.
I never insulted ancient civilization.
And you do not want to rile up
No.
environmentalists. I mean, that's seriously, I still am embarrassed about that to this day. But I'd like to answer that. What's the most important lesson I've learned? It's such a cliche, but everybody has a story.
Yep. And
Everybody has a story. I don't care who you are, where you are, what, and I just, that's what fascinates me about journalism is you think there's nothing there, and then you probe or you get underneath the surface just a little bit. You find all these great stories.
Well, and after 95 years between us, we're still finding brand new stories. How cool is that?
No, it's never ending.
I think that's a great note to end on. Listen for the stories, talk to each other, and there are so many stories still out there to be told.
Well, it's nice being with you today, Lois. We're,
Always fun.
like we said when we started, there's a reason why we're in print.
Yeah, no, it's true.
But thanks for watching.